So we know that the government runs deficits year after year after year, so that tells us that they have to raise money somehow, and we can take a look at the three different ways they raise money using the government budget constraint. G minus T equals a change in M plus a change in B plus a change in A. So let's go ahead, write down this equation, and break down each of these components one by one to see exactly where the government can raise money in order to finance all of its deficits. Simply put, the government budget constraint. Government budget constraint. Budget constraint. And with the government budget constraint, we have G minus T on the left-hand side. G minus T, government spending minus taxes, equals the change in M plus the change in B plus the change in A. Change in A. And these three things that we see on the right-hand side are exactly the ways that the government can raise money in order to finance deficits. So left-hand side, as we've already said, G minus T, this is government spending minus taxes. Government spending minus taxes. Minus taxes. And in this instance, when government spending is greater than taxes, we are running a deficit. So we're going to be working with a positive G minus T difference in this case. So a positive G minus T tells us that we're working with a deficit. So here, just changing things up just a little bit, G minus T, if this number is positive, we are running a deficit. And if it is a deficit, that tells us that the right-hand side has to be, some of these numbers have to be positive as well. So remember, left-hand side has to equal the right-hand side. So three different ways they can raise money. Change in M is one typical way, which is going to be the change in the money supply. Change in money supply. And how exactly do they change the money supply? Well, they're going to go ahead and sell bonds to the Federal Reserve. Sell bonds to Federal Reserve. Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve is a central bank of the United States, and if the government needs money right now, they can go ahead, sell some bonds to the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve will say, okay, give me those bonds. I'll go ahead and print out some money. Bam, here you go. Here's your money. You can finance your deficits for another day or so. So here, the Federal Reserve has the power to actually create money, and we'll take a closer look at them as we get into our money chapters. Next, we take a look at the change in B, and the change in B is going to be the change in bonds. Change in bonds. So the federal government, they can also sell bonds to the public. So to people like you and I, they sell bonds to banks, they sell bonds to foreign countries. Everybody wants a piece of US national debt, and that's where the change in B, the change in bonds, is going to come into play. So here, they sell bonds to the public. And these first two categories that we see right here, the change in M and the change in B, these are the most typical ways of how the government is going to finance its deficits. So here, the vast majority, the biggest percentages for the government financing these deficits come from selling bonds to the Federal Reserve and selling bonds to the public. The last way they can finance their deficits is going to be the change in A right here, which is going to be a change in assets. Change in assets. So essentially, what the government does is they have a lot of assets. They just go ahead and sell them off. So sell assets. Government owns a lot of property. They can lease out properties as well, lease out a few of their technological sort of aspects. So here, change in assets, it's the smallest percentage out of these three particular variables. So let's go ahead and take a closer look at change in M, change in B, change in A, just a little bit more with a little bit of methodology, with a little bit of channels right here. So here, first way that the government can raise money to finance its deficits is with a positive change in M. So change in M bigger than 0. So if they decide to say, hey, let's go ahead, change the money supply in order to finance our deficits, there is a little bit of a pattern that they need to go ahead and take a look at. So here, remember that if this is greater than 0, the government sells bonds to the Federal Reserve. So government sells bonds to the Federal Reserve, to the Fed. So in this instance, you have to be sure that the Federal Reserve and the U.S. government, they are two completely different entities. The U.S. government, they are the ones that control fiscal policy, while the Federal Reserve, they're the ones that control monetary policy. And we'll get a closer look at the Fed, like we said in the money chapters. So they have their own goals in mind, but they do most oftentimes work together on a lot of different economic goals. So how do we start off the process of the government selling bonds to the Fed? Well, the Fed is going to go ahead and buy these bonds. So Fed buys bonds. And the Federal Reserve, as we said, has the power to create money. Using its power To create money. To create money. And when money is actually created, we can say formally that they're going to be increasing the money supply. Increasing money supply. So anytime the Federal Reserve decides to increase the money supply, you know that they're going to be buying bonds from the government or other sources. So they're just essentially pumping money into our economy. So when they do so, when they increase the money supply, as we said, this pumps money into the money supply, pumps money into money supply. And when they do so, that's going to help finance government deficits. To help finance government deficits. Government deficits. And this entire process that we work here in this change in M, there is a special name that we can give to it. It's called monetizing the debt. So anytime the government decides to sell bonds to the Federal Reserve, using all these mechanisms, these channels that we see right here, the formal way that we can say is that it's going to be monetizing the debt. Monetizing the debt. So here, the word money comes into play right here. They're essentially just monetizing the federal deficit, the federal debt in this instance. So here, just a little bit of a shorthand way to say, hey, change in M is the same as monetizing the debt. Second, we go ahead and take a look at the change in B. So change in B, and that's where the government is going to go ahead and sell bonds to the public. So bonds are sold to the public. So if you wanted to go ahead and buy a portion of U.S. debt, you can go ahead and do so right now. The government, they have these auctions for their treasury bills or T-bills, and they have it for different maturities. So 1 week, 2 weeks, 1 month, 1 year, 10 years, 30 years. If you want a piece of U.S. national debt, you can go ahead and buy their treasury bills. And a vast majority of people, they do like to hold treasury bills or bonds into their portfolio, into their financial assets, because they're seen as one of the safest assets in the world. It's very unlikely that the U.S. government is going to go ahead and default on the bonds that they have right here. So this is why banks, foreign countries, foreign individuals, they all invest in U.S. bonds. They like to go ahead and buy these bonds. The vast majority of the U.S. deficit is actually going to be financed with the change in bonds that we see right here. And the other portion is going to be financed by selling bonds to the Federal Reserve by monetizing the debt. So I think these two categories account for nearly about 75 to 80%, I believe, the last time I checked. And then finally here we have change in A greater than 0, and that's where the U.S. government is going to have some type of asset sales. So here we have asset sales. So the government, like we said, they own a lot of property, and if they need to raise money fairly quickly, they're going to go ahead and sell off some of their properties. They may sell off some of their telecommunication spectra, maybe lease some offshore oil leases. Basically, they have a lot of property at their disposal, and they can do a lot of different things with their property. One of the things being selling it or leasing it, and that will help to raise money in order to finance their deficits. So 3 different ways that we see right here for the government to finance its deficits: change in M by monetizing the debt, change in B by selling bonds to the public, and change in A by having some type of asset sales. So with this in mind, we are going to be a little bit more focused in the change in M and the change in B sort of categories right here, because they are the largest components and they do tie in with the Federal Reserve fairly well as additionally. So with all of this is going to lead us into a very big discussion, segue us into a very big analysis of, is the national debt, how much is too much? So what are the few implications of having such a large national debt, and what does this mean for you and I and our future generations? So this is going to be a very big discussion. There are maybe 4 or 5 implications that we can talk about, and we're going to see all of these things in the next section.